What's happening? Thanks for joining us as always. It is much appreciated. Happy hump day on this Wednesday afternoon. Adam Schefter wrote about the most interesting teams in the NFL this offseason. And the Patriots were ranked fourth, the fourth most interesting team in the NFL this offseason. And for a lot of the reasons we have discussed, he talked about the money, the cap space the Patriots have. He talked about having the number 4 pick in the draft, which we've talked about an awful lot. We'll talk about more going into the forward next few months. He talked about Drake May, young quarterback. A lot of people in the game feel great about Drake May, his ability to be a franchise quarterback. So all of those things we know. Money, great draft capital, young, promising quarterback. So that's why Adam Schefter had the Patriots as the fourth most interesting NFL team heading into the offseason. I go back to Mike Vrabel's press conference, his introductory press conference, and he underlined two things, two important things as the next head coach of the Patriots that he is going to be focused on. One of those things was protect Drake May. Protect your young franchise quarterback. Make sure that you have the offensive line that can do a good enough job to keep the young man safe. That was one of the things that he underlined. He also talked about impacting the opposing quarterback. So protecting Drake May and impacting the opposing quarterback. The plan for this offseason, folks, it is in focus. We know exactly what the Patriots want to do. But if we didn't know what the Patriots wanted to do, if we didn't feel confident that we knew off the introductory press conference from Mike Vrabel when he highlighted offensive line play, protecting the quarterback, and defensive line play, going after the other quarterback. Here's Greg Bedard on our podcast that we do this week. We recorded it yesterday. Greg said, quote, "From what I've been told, the offensive and defensive lines are going to be the top priority this offseason." I'll say it again. From what I've been told, the offensive and defensive lines are going to be the top priority this offseason. Not one of the priorities, not one of the top priorities. No. Bedard said offensive line, defensive line, the top priority this offseason for the Patriots. For Mike Vrabel, the front office, that's the top priority. Karen Guregian, OG, love her work, writes at Mass Live. She wrote this about 10 days ago. Pass protection was a huge issue. So was run defense in generating a pass rush. Vrabel won't leave this to chance. He won't apply Band-Aids and pray they stick like Elliott Wolf and company did last year with the offensive line. Whether it's free agency, the draft, or both, Vrabel will fix the perennial trouble spot. Here's what Matt Hasselbeck said to Karen on the Ion Foxborough podcast. Quote, "If you look at who the coach is, he's going to build from the inside out. For him, it's going to be the foundation first. It's going to be interior defensive line and offensive line." So Greg Bedard this week on the podcast that we do says the number one priority, the top priority that he's heard is offensive defensive line. Karen Guregian wrote a couple of weeks ago that Vrabel is going to fix the perennial trouble spot. Matt Hasselbeck on the Ion Foxborough podcast says Vrabel's going to build this thing from the inside out. It's going to be the foundation first. It's going to be interior defensive line and offensive line. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. Build from the inside out. If we go back to last year's draft, many of you have been with me since that time. I appreciate all of you who have been here that long. I appreciate the ones that are just joining us. But last year, before the draft, as we talked about all the different options the Patriots would have, I was a big fan of Drake May. Drake May was my number one priority, right? The quarterback was the number one priority. Whether it was going to be Daniels or May, I believed steadfastly in the idea of drafting the quarterback because your team is not much of anything unless you have a quarterback that can do his own end of the work. So I was always pro Drake May. I love the Drake May pick. I stand by Drake May. I planted my flag next to him several months ago, a year ago, as a matter of fact. But the other conversation that we had, if it wasn't going to be the quarterback, there were a lot of people saying Marvin Harrison Jr. should have been the pick at number 3. A lot of people thought Marvin Harrison Jr., generational talent at wide receiver. The Patriots need a wide receiver. It makes too much sense. Forget about the quarterback. How many drafts actually give you 3 really good quarterbacks? What are the chances that all 3 of those quarterbacks are going to work out? I remember all of those conversations, and I know many of you remember those conversations as well, even though the further we get removed from those conversations, there are people disingenuously trying to tell you that Drake May was always the easy answer. Nope, that's not how a lot of people talked about last year's draft. I'm not buying it. They're trying to sell it after Drake May's rookie season. They're trying to sell it. I'm not buying it. We talked about if Drake May's not the pick, what would you do? A lot of people wanted Marvin Harrison. I wanted Alt, right? I wanted Joe Alt. I said, no. If you're not going to draft the quarterback, then you draft the ridiculously talented left tackle. You draft a guy who could be your anchor at left tackle for the next 10 years. That's what I would have done if I wasn't going to draft Drake May. I've always been of the idea to build it from the inside out, find that left tackle, find the offensive lineman that you need to make this thing work. I've been a big proponent. Many people get tired. They get bored of offensive line talk. And I understand not a lot of people can go out there and break down offensive line play. I can't even break down offensive line play to the point of, the Bedards and the Taylor Kyles and the Evan Lazars, the Brandon Thorns. I can't talk offensive line play like those guys. Those guys are great at doing that. So I understand. Gets a little tiring, right? Gets a little boring to talk about offensive line. But this is what we should be looking at. This is what the plan should be. Figure out the offensive line, figure out the defensive line. We just looked at the Super Bowl on Sunday night. We talked about it on Monday's podcast. What happened? Kansas City's offensive line got their tuchuses handed to them by that Philly defensive line. If you don't have an offensive line that is at least average, if not above average, you're behind the 8 ball in the NFL. So this is exactly what Mike Vrabel should be focused on, exactly what that front office should be focused on, building from the inside out. And I'm here to tell you that it's already started. It has already started, folks, because we're going to sit there and we're going to focus on free agency. We're going to focus on the draft. We're going to focus on the new shiny toys that are acquired by this front office and brought in to solve the problems that we've seen over and over and over again with this football team going back to the final stretch of Bill Belichick's tenure. But the Patriots have already started to address this issue. And we talked about it last week. The only thing you can do up until this point, really, right, before you get to free agency in March 10th is when the tampering period begins. You can start talking to people, even though we know in the NFL there's a lot of talk happening anyway before that point. But the only thing that you can control right now, the only thing that you can control in this moment is the coaching staff. And that's why I'm here to tell you that the Patriots have already showed us. They have already showed us that the number one priority this offseason is going to be offensive line and defensive line. How have they shown us that? Thanks to the coaching staff. They've shown us that. They're not messing around. They bring in Doug Marrone as the offensive line coach, guy that's been in the NFL for decades, has worked with, I would say, hundreds of offensive linemen throughout his career. But they didn't stop at Doug Marrone. They brought in Jason Hotailing, who was Vrabel's offensive line coach in Tennessee, led that offensive line room. They didn't stop there. They kept Kugler on this coaching staff. Robert Kugler is still here as an assistant offensive line coach. So they kept the guy who shows a lot of promise that's already here. This team has already invested in the offensive line by investing in the coaching staff of said offensive line. Marrone, Hotailing, and Kugler, they are no joke. And that tells us that it is a priority. That should tell us that they understand they've got to fix this thing just through the coaching staff. And then you look at the defensive line, because we pay so much attention to the offense. The defensive line, similar, right? I mean, Terrell Williams is going to be your defensive coordinator, but he's been a defensive line coach for a long time. Dan Campbell called him the best defensive line coach in football last year. So your defensive coordinator, his background, his wheelhouse is defensive line. They bring in Clint McMillan, another guy who is very well respected when you talk about defense up front. And then they brought in outside linebackers coach Mike Smith. And if you don't know about Mike Smith, Taylor Kyles of CLNS posted about him this week. Mike Smith has an impressive track record. He's going to be the pass rush specialist for the Patriots, right? Mike Smith helped get Pro Bowl seasons out of Danielle Hunter, Zadarius Smith, and Dee Ford. He helped develop Rashawn Gary. He also recruited Zadarius Smith, an impending free agent, to Minnesota in 2022. So Mike Smith, outside linebackers coach, has shown the ability to get a lot out of outside linebacker and pass rushers, defensive edges. So even before we get to free agency in March, even before we get to the draft in April, the decisions regarding the coaching staff tells us the Patriots are dead serious on making sure their offensive line and defensive line improves this offseason. And I would imagine they hope that the offensive and defensive lines improve significantly this offseason. But they have already shown us they're serious about it. Thanks to the coaches they've hired, experienced guys with track records, guys that we all understand are NFL coaches. That's how you start to work on the problem. They've started to work on the problem. Build from the inside out, protect Drake May. I want to talk about protecting Drake May in a minute. But before I get there, don't forget to help us out. You can do that by doing a few different things. You know what I'm going to say if you've watched this podcast before. Click that thumbs up. More thumbs up helps us with this YouTube channel, helps drive traffic, helps us with the algorithm. More thumbs up means more eyeballs. That's how the algorithm works. So don't forget to like this podcast as you watch and listen. That helps us an awful lot. Don't forget to comment as well. Marilyn T throwing in here about Matt Patricia going to The Ohio State. Yes, he is going to be the Ohio State defensive coordinator. So throw your comments in here as I continue to talk about the Patriots offseason plan. How do you feel about this coaching staff at the line of scrimmage? How do you feel about O-line, D-line being the top priority reportedly of this front office and Mike Vrabel this offseason? So don't forget to comment. Those comments also help us with the algorithm. So don't forget to like, don't forget to comment. And finally, you know the deal. If you enjoy what we do, or maybe you hate watch us, don't forget to subscribe. We're trying to get to 6,000 subscribers by the time NFL free agency hits, which is March 10th. So we've got a little bit under a month to hit 6,000 subscribers. We surpassed 5,870 last night. So we're under 150 subscribers away. Help us out. Like, comment, and subscribe. Spotify, Apple Pods, friends, rate and review. You can help us out there as well. All right, before I get to Drake May, protecting Drake May, just that thought, $2 super chat from Derek. How much overlap does Graham and Barmore have? So how much overlap does Graham and Barmore have? Trying to think of, am I missing something? Who's Graham? Who's Graham? Am I missing something? Who's Graham? Who's the Graham that you reference? I might be just missing it. Maybe I'm like a little foggy in the brain. Okay. Thank you. I wasn't thinking draft. Mason Graham. Thank you. Thank you very much. What was that? MA 177. Barmore and Mason Graham. I don't know why they would. Oh, do you mean talent-wise? I think you can play both guys. I don't think there's an issue playing both of them in interior. Now, the question is, Mason Graham, is he actually a 3-down interior defensive lineman? We'll talk about that when we get more into the draft. Is he actually a 3-down guy? If he's a 3-down guy, I think you can play both. You look at what Mike Vrabel likes to do defensively. He likes to get to the quarterback. He likes, even man fronts. So you're probably going to have a 4-man front defensively. So if you have a 4-man front, you get the 2 edges and 2 guys in the middle, right? The 2 ends / outside linebackers. And then you've got the 2 guys in the middle. I think Mason Graham and Barmore can play together. Is Godshaw part of this? I don't know. We'll see. We know that Godshaw had a very close relationship with Gerard Mayo. We'll see what his future's like here. But I think he could play both. Barmore proved himself to be a 3-down defensive tackle back in 2023. Of course, we've got to see how he comes back physically from the ailments that he's had, the blood clots. But I think you could play both guys. Absolutely. Anonymous with a $20 super chat. Thank you, Anonymous. Nick, thoughts about backup quarterback? Feel we need someone different, veteran, and better for the real possibility Drake gets hurt. Well, first, I think we will see how this new coaching staff feels about Joe Milton. If you don't trade Joe Milton, which we talked about a few weeks ago, if you don't trade Milton, Milton could be your backup quarterback, right? He could be your QB2. He's very affordable. But, do you want a guy who's in his second year along with your second year starting quarterback to be the backup for that guy? Or would you rather go with the veteran, as you mentioned, Anonymous? If Joe Milton is ready to be the backup, I'd be fine with just keeping Milton. Now, maybe you bring in a veteran to challenge Milton. Maybe you look at, Joe Flacco. Maybe you look at other quarterbacks across the league. I don't have the list in front of me. I believe Marcus Mariota is a free agent this year. He'd be interesting because, of course, Vrabel had Mariota down in Tennessee. Do you lean towards somebody who's more athletic, which would take you out of the Flacco category, and look at somebody depending on what, Josh McDaniels is going to do with his offense? Do you want to get similar styled quarterbacks so they're all learning the same things, they're all being taught the same things, they all play a similar fashion of football? That would be interesting, right? Because if McDaniels is going to lean into designed runs with Drake May, which I think he will run designed runs with May in 2025, if he's going to do that, then you might need more of an athletic presence as your second quarterback, an emergency quarterback. But right now, there is no other quarterbacks on this roster aside from May and Milton, and we'll see if the front office and coaching staff feels like Milton can be that guy. And, again, maybe you pick up a veteran to have a quarterback competition for the backup spot in camp. I'm not against that. I don't know how many of those backup quarterbacks would be interested in coming here if they knew they didn't have a chance to win the job. But I think Jacoby, based off his comments late in the year, I don't think he's going to be back. Now, maybe he has a change of heart because Mike Vrabel's here. And when Brissett said what he said to Mike Reese, which was pretty much he wasn't thrilled with how things were done, maybe that was a Gerard Mayo problem. Maybe that was an Alex Van Pelt problem. Jacoby Brissett obviously has history with Josh McDaniels. So maybe Brissett would be more comfortable coming back with McDaniels and you would have the same three quarterbacks that you had last year. We will see. But I'm not against bringing in a veteran guy to at least compete against Milton for quarterback 2. Marilyn T, $25 super chat. Happy Valentine's Day. Buy your wife a drink on Friday. Marilyn, thank you. I appreciate the $25 super chat. Thank you for the support. Thank you for the generosity. And I will certainly put that to good use on Friday. Kelly and I were actually just talking about what we were going to do on Friday. I'm not a big Valentine's Day guy. I think it's all about marketing and all about making money. But I understand that the women of the world, many of them enjoy Valentine's Day. So it's a day for the wife. So we'll see. We'll see what she comes up with as far as Friday goes. But thank you, Marilyn, for the $25 super chat. All right. Let's get back to this idea of protecting Drake May. Again, priority number 1 reportedly is going to be offensive and defensive lines for Mike Vrabel's program. I'm all for it. Big fan of it. This is what the Patriots should be doing. They should be addressing the line of scrimmage. The line of scrimmage offensive line last year we know was abominable. Even though it was not plan A in front of Drake May, it was still just not nearly good enough. And plan A might have not been good enough, right? So they've got to fix that offensive line. The defensive line, they couldn't get pressure against the quarterbacks that they played. They were absolutely brutal in trying to get pass rush. When they blitzed, they got burnt. So it was just a disaster. So yes, you should start fixing the trenches ASAP. And it all starts with Drake May because this program, folks, is nothing there at Gillette Stadium if Drake May can't be the guy. You have to do everything that you can do this offseason to help Drake May. And that starts up front. Give the young man some time to throw the football. right? You don't want pass rushers breathing down his neck within 1.5 seconds every freaking snap. If Drake May is successful, if Drake May develops, this football team will develop. This football team will eventually succeed along with the quarterback. So everything starts with Drake May. You have to do everything within your power to make sure you are surrounding the quarterback with protection and talent. So yes, you absolutely start in the trenches, and I start at the offensive line. It is priority number one. We can look at wide receiver 1. We can look at defensive end. We can look at some other spots on this roster that need repair. But it all starts for me with the big guys up front. Because if you take care of May and you develop May, you are on your way to being a successful football franchise again. If you mess this up and you fail to protect Drake May in 2025, things can continue to go wrong. Things can continue to go off the rails, because as happy as I am about this coaching staff and as much potential on paper this coaching staff has, it's not going to mean much if your quarterback is getting drilled every single weekend. So that's where it starts. It starts on the offensive line and protecting Drake May. The Bill Belichick tenure went horribly wrong when he started to make bad decision after bad decision on the offensive line. You can look directly at the offensive line in the deterioration of that O-line as the first reason why Belichick is gone. Now, of course, you can look at the Brady decision. That was rather huge, right? But if you had an offensive line protecting quarterbacks, I think you win more games in 2023 than you did. And if you win more games in 2023, I think Belichick, keeps himself safe. But you can go back to, the Brady conversation. But at the same time, the Brady conversation and decision was happening. It was unfolding. At the same exact time, Belichick was messing up the offensive line. He drafted Isaiah Wynn as a tackle. It didn't work out. And then after drafting Isaiah Wynn, he failed to draft an offensive lineman in the top 100 picks until Cole Strange, when he drafted him in the first round. And that was a questionable draft pick. You can go back to the Joe Thuney decision, the Shaq Mason trade, not re-signing Ted Karras, who was a steady, dependable offensive lineman. All of those different decisions, the bad drafting, you can look at all of that and say that was the eventual death knell of Bill Belichick in New England as the Patriots head coach and football, quote-unquote, czar. That was it. He never fixed the problem. How long have we been talking about left tackle, folks? You had a hope, you had to cross your fingers that Trent Brown was going to work out. Again, Isaiah Wynn did not work out. And he never addressed it. He never used draft capital to draft young linemen in the top 3 rounds. It was always, we're going to take a stab at this guy. Even Mike Owenu was like a 6th-round pick. And that was so annoying year after year after year after year. So a big part of the Belichick problem towards the tail end of his career here in New England was the fact that he just failed at the offensive line a bunch of different ways. And you can't do that if you want to build it right. Now, I will say, you can't rebuild this thing in one offseason. I don't think that you're going to go from the offensive line you had last year to all of a sudden having a top 5, a top 8 offensive line in 2025. I don't think you're going to be able to fix it all, but you can take a big-time first step. You can take a big-time first step this offseason because there's going to be opportunity. There's going to be opportunity for the Patriots to make moves this offseason. Between free agency and the draft, there are options. You do have opportunity in free agency at the tackle spot. Right now, you have Ronnie Stanley, Alaric Jackson, Jedrick Wills, Dan Moore, maybe Mekhi Becton if you want to move him back from guard to tackle. Even if you want to talk about interior offensive line and you look at guards, you've got Trey Smith from Kansas City. You've got Aaron Banks. You've got Mekhi Becton, who played great at right guard this year for the Eagles. You have some answers in free agency. Now, of course, some of these guys can end up signing and you take them off the market. But as of right now, February 12th, 2025, Stanley, Jackson, Wills, Moore, Becton, Smith, Banks, all of those guys could help you up front on the offensive line. And then you look at the defensive line. You look at edge. You look at outside linebacker. Josh Sweat is a free agent. Zach Bond is a free agent. Joe Tryon is a free agent. Hassan Reddick, Charles Amenahu, Azeez Ojulari. You also have Khalil Mack if he wants to continue to play football, and who knows if Mack would ever join a team like the Patriots. He's probably going to look for a contender, but there are more names. The big picture, the overall point is that free agency has several players that can help you on both the offensive and defensive lines. And then you look at the draft. Daniel Jeremiah of the NFL Network posted this yesterday. Last year at this time, Jeremiah had potential starter grades on 12 defensive tackles. So in last year's draft, Daniel Jeremiah had 12 defensive tackles that he regarded as potential starters in the NFL. He had 12 of them last year. This year, he has 24 of them. Daniel Jeremiah literally has twice as many defensive tackle prospects in this draft that he sees as potential NFL starters than he had in the 2024 draft. This draft in April is absolutely freaking loaded with defensive line talent, whether it's on the outside at edge or it's on the inside at defensive tackle. This draft is loaded with defensive talent up front. Loaded. As Jeremiah pointed out, ridiculous amount of depth at the defensive tackle position in this draft class. And if you want to look at edge, if you want to look at edge players, Dane Brugler of The Athletic, Brugler has 10 of his top 50 prospects this year play the edge. So when you look at free agency and you look at the draft, what you see is a ton of depth on the defensive line and some really good options on the offensive line. So you are going to have the opportunity to address multiple needs up front. And since this is going to be their number one priority, I would imagine that they're going to hit it hard in free agency and see if they can land at least a couple of middle-class free agents and then go into the draft knowing, all right, if we can draft one or two other defensive linemen because it's so damn deep in this draft, we could really rebuild our defensive line because you've got Barmore, hopefully, fingers crossed. You've got Keon White. You've got Godshaw if you want to keep him. If you can sign two middle-class free agents or, one of the top guys, if you can sign Zach Bond and give him a ton of money, and then you go into the draft and you draft a couple of guys, now all of a sudden your defensive line isn't useless. So the draft, because of the depth, it's just a major, major thing for the Patriots this year. That depth of the defensive line in the draft and a number of the names in free agency will give the Patriots some opportunities to address what they want to address. And by the way, adding to the offensive line and defensive line doesn't rule out adding other positions. Sometimes people treat this as like, if you're gonna go out and offensive line and defensive line are the top priority, what about all these other positions, right? What about wide receiver, Nick? What about free safety? What about tight end? What about running back if you're not sold on Ramondre Stevenson? It doesn't mean if you add offensive linemen and defensive linemen, it doesn't mean that like all of a sudden you can't go out there and spend money on wide receiver. You can't draft other positions. Of course you can. I don't think Mike Vrabel and company are going to walk into this offseason and go, offensive line check, defensive line check, we're done, not going to do anything else. I don't think that's the case. So you can still address other needs along with the offensive line and defensive line. And if you look at the Patriots defensive line, what's interesting, they've got a couple of guys, aside from Barmore and Keon White, they've got a couple of fascinating younger pieces. And I'm not telling you that they're going to be starters, but as far as depth goes, like if you have Barmore, you have Keon White, They signed Jeremiah Farms yesterday to a 2-year contract extension, according to Mike Reese. So they keep Jeremiah Farms, who's a good rotational piece. And I thought Jaquelin Roy, before he got hurt, I thought he was showing some potential. So maybe you have something with Roy coming back. So if you have Roy and you have Farms for some depth purposes, you've got Barmore, you've got White. If you can add a couple of other guys to this mix that are legitimate day one starters, then you feel pretty decent to go along with the scheme of Vrabel and Terrell Williams, which we will get into in a later podcast, because we have yet to dive into the defensive system and how that's going to change things fundamentally here in New England. Greg Fields, $10 super chat. By the way, help us out. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. That's how we build this community. We continue to march forward and get ready for free agency. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern, live right here on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe. Greg Fields, thanks for the 10. Hey, Nick, we were talking in the comments. We enjoyed Grumpy Greg and you go at it yesterday on your joint podcast. I enjoyed it too. Greg and I don't go at it like that very often. We don't get into the back and forth very often because we tend to agree on a lot of things. But when we go at it, we go at it. And I enjoyed the conversation. If anybody's missed it, the Greg Bedard Patriots podcast with Nick Cattles, recorded it yesterday, and we had one hell of a back and forth about Mahomes and the Chiefs and Brady and the Patriots. I love Greg, but Greg was trying to sell me on this idea that Patrick Mahomes was pretty much not at fault for Sunday night, that he had almost nothing to do with it. It was everybody else's fault. And let's just say I disagreed with Greg. So if you want to check it out, I think it's worthwhile. I thought it was good content. So thank you, Greg. And the one thing I would say too about that is when Greg and I go back and forth, it's not to get clicks, and it's not to, it's not to create engagement. It's just it naturally happens. We go at it, and we enjoy the haymakers back and forth, and it's 100% genuine. 100% genuine. All right, speaking of Mike Vrabel, I've got one more thing I wanted to talk about today. Did you see this Jeff Howe story? I tweeted this at Nick C Radio. If you want to follow me on Twitter at Nick C Radio. I'm also on Blue Sky. If you're on Blue Sky, you can check me out there. Also on Instagram, but I tweet a lot. I Blue Sky some, and IG is really just helping promote the podcast. But I tweeted this out. Jeff Howe, The Athletic, he polled 10 NFL executives and coaches, and he asked the executives and the coaches, which hire was the best hire? Like rank your head coach hires in the NFL. So here are the top 3. There was a tie for second place. Again, this was from 10 executives and coaches in the NFL. Pete Carroll and Ben Johnson tied for second place. They finished with 33 points. The number 1 hire, according to the executives and the coaches, the number 1 hire by far was Mike Vrabel. So Ben Johnson, Pete Carroll finished with 33 points. Mike Vrabel finished with 48 points. And if you look at, some people might say, oh, that's because Ben Johnson took some votes, right? Pete Carroll took some votes. No. If you look at how the voting broke down, Vrabel finished with 45 first place points. 45. Ben Johnson, for example, finished with 5. So, I mean, this was a blowout. And Jeff Howe wrote, Vrabel dominated this vote, proving how respected he is by his peers. Vrabel will command a more disciplined culture in New England after the organization was stuck in somewhat of a purgatory last season. Here's what an executive said to Jeff Howe about the Vrabel hiring. Quote, Vrabel has been a successful head coach with bona fide leadership ability, which is underrated with the personalities in today's game. I think that's a great point. When you look at today's game, the egos, the personalities, the social media stuff, it's very important to have somebody in that locker room as the head coach who has, as the executive calls it, bona fide leadership ability. It's crucial to the operation, and Vrabel has that. The executive continued to say, quote, he's really organized situationally within the game. His personality fits the Northeast, where they're going to run the ball and play good defense, and he has a quarterback. So again, the Jeff Howe article today, story at The Athletic, polling 10 NFL executives and coaches, asking them which head coach hiring is the best hiring. By far, Mike Vrabel won this. He smoked the competition. So it's not a homer take. It's not a Patriot fan take that the Patriots had the best head coach hire in the NFL this offseason. It is how the NFL feels. It is how fellow coaches feel. It is how executives feel. And we've read these reports from day one that Mike Vrabel was seen as the guy. So Mike Vrabel, by far the most popular, the favorite head coach hire of the NFL during the head coach cycle. And it's difficult to rebuild the program after back-to-back 4-win seasons. You need some credibility. And it goes back to when we had the conversation before Vrabel was hired. We talked about Ben Johnson. We talked about Vrabel. And Mike Vrabel was my number one guy. And he was my number one guy last offseason. But the Mayo contract was the Mayo contract. What happened, happened. But Vrabel was my number one guy because of what that executive is talking about, the bona fide leadership ability, the fact that he led an NFL team in Tennessee for 6 years, the fact that he got to an AFC championship game with that team, the fact that he won 12 games with that team. That's what this program needed. This program was rocky, right? It still is rocky. When you look at back-to-back 4-win seasons, that ain't good. And so if you go out and you hire an unknown, that unknown might end up being awesome. Ben Johnson might end up being awesome in Chicago. But the idea of hiring Vrabel, number one, he was the best guy on the market. Number two, he has the history. He understands building a program. That's what my number one thing was when we talked about Vrabel versus Ben Johnson. Vrabel's been there before. And so when you look at this poll from Jeff Howe's story, it backs that up. You know, most builds take time. Some of them happen quick. The Washington Commanders went from the second worst team in football last year to the NFC Championship game. That's not normally how it works out. But when you look at a lot of the builds, it takes a couple of years. So back-to-back 4-win seasons, it's going to take some time. It's going to take a year or two to really kind of steady this ship, right? It's going to take this offseason, and hopefully you take a step this year. You get to like the 7-8 win mark. And then you got the 26 off season. And by the 2026 season, you are ready to be a legitimate playoff contender. That's the ultimate plan. So to have somebody who understands what it takes to help build the program is just gigantic. Mike Vrabel and Drake May are the building blocks towards respectability for the New England Patriots franchise. If Mike Vrabel does what he can do or what we think he can do, and Drake May continues to develop and ends up being as good of a quarterback as we think he could end up being, those are the two building blocks. Those are the two pillars for this franchise moving forward. Vrabel and May. Those are the two pillars that this franchise is going to stand up on. The two legs. That's it. If you've got the head coach and you've got the quarterback, you're going in the right direction. And right now it feels like they've got those two guys. It feels like they're taking a step forward. Now, they've got to add talent. We've talked about it. I'll continue to say it throughout this offseason. They've got to add talent. But the building blocks, quarterback, head coach, feels like the Patriots are in very good hands. That's the way it feels. But it is going to be a critical offseason. Going back to the Adam Schefter thing, Patriots, the fourth most interesting team in the NFL this offseason because of the money, the draft capital, the fact you have Drake May, the fact you added Mike Vrabel. But this is going to be a critical offseason because now you've got to go into free agency. Now you've got to go into the draft, and you've got to hit. You've got to hit a number of times. You need more talent on this roster. I mean, I truly cannot wait to talk about this offseason and free agency. We are going to get into it, and I can't wait to talk about it. Terry with a $20 super chat. Thank you, Terry. Nick, since you told us on your Patreon that Kelly liked coffee, my super chat is so you can buy her a Starbucks for Valentine's Day. Well, thank you, Terry. So that is the Kelly Starbucks Fund. Yeah, I'm not on the Patreon. We do this off-the-cuff podcast. We also do a Q&A with the members. And Terry asked me if I were a Dunkin' person or a Starbucks person and I had to share the news that I am neither. I am not a coffee person. I've never drank a cup of coffee in my life. Never. Not once. I haven't had a cup of coffee. I took a sip of coffee when I was younger, didn't like it, never went back to it. But Kelly, my wife, huge fan of coffee. 2 cups a day at least. And she would probably drink a lot more than that, but I probably make her feel guilty. So, but with that said, I'm not a coffee person, but if I were a coffee person, I said on the Patreon Q&A this week that I would lean towards Dunkin' because I used to get my donuts from Dunkin'. The double chocolate. Oh, I haven't had a donut in a long time. Now I want a donut, Terry. See what you did? I haven't had a donut in years. Honestly, I can't tell you the last time I went to Dunkin' and got a donut. It's been a long time. Way too long. But yeah, not a coffee guy. But I'm sure Kelly will appreciate the $20 super chat so she can enjoy a Starbucks coffee. Not a coffee guy. Not a coffee guy. All right, don't forget, I am a beer guy. So we do Crafts and Kickoffs tomorrow night. By the way, the Patreon page, if you're interested, if you like what we do about the Patriots on this podcast, over at the Patreon, it's $5 a month, $1.25 a week. What we do is we give you some extra Patriots content, but we also talk about the Celtics, Bruins, and Red Sox over at that Patreon. We do the membership Q&A on a bi-weekly basis. You can ask me anything. Nothing is off the table. Talk about radio, talk about food, talk about music, talk about drinking, whatever it is. And then I also do this off-the-cuff podcast on Fridays, which is I talk national sports, and I also just kind of talk about random things on my mind. So if you want to check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/Nick Cattles, $5 a month. I don't usually promote it too much here, but I should promote it more. You can look down right there on the little ticker, and it has the information. So $5 a month. Thank you to all the Patreon members for supporting me. They do terrific stuff. Thanks to all of you who support me with this podcast. Like, comment, and subscribe means the world to me. That's how we continue to build this community one step at a time. Crafts and Kickoffs, my NFL podcast, tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. I drink a beer and we talk football. That is going to be the last Crafts and Kickoffs episode of the season until we get to free agency. I'm going to sneak one in during free agency, and I will likely sneak one in during the draft as well. So Crafts and Kickoffs tomorrow night. And then Friday, of course, 3 o'clock Eastern, right here on the YouTube channel. We go live. If something big breaks before then, we'll be all over it. So that is really the docket of things that I do every week. Greg Fields jumps in with a $10 super chat. Nick, get a Dunkin's Boston Cream. Your Boston Cream guy? All right, Boston Cream guy. I could see that. Don't mind a Boston Cream. I did like, again, though, I love the double chocolate, like the chocolate glaze with then the chocolate on top of it. That was my go-to. That's a banger. The double chocolate's a banger. I'm also a sucker for the ones with the sprinkles on it. I know I sound like I'm 10. I don't care. I like the sprinkled donuts. And they probably have so many new donuts I'm unaware of because I haven't even walked into a Dunkin' Donuts looking at their donut selection or options in like forever. So the Boston Cream. Maybe I'll have a donut on the podcast. Just sit here and eat a donut. That would be entertaining. That would be entertaining, huh? All right, like, comment, subscribe. Appreciate every single one of you. Tomorrow night, Crafts and Kickoff, 7 o'clock. Drink a beer, talk some football. And then Friday at 3, we'll continue with our Patriots offseason thoughts. Till then, I appreciate you.